Imagine the cold, not the crisp, clean cold of a winter morning, but a damp, clinging cold that seeps from stone walls and settles deep in the bones. A cold that feels ancient and alive. Imagine the fire, a sputtering, hungry thing in the center of a cave. It's the only source of warmth, the only bastion against a press of absolute darkness. It throws dancing, distorted shadows that twist familiar shapes into monsters on the rock. In this flickering world of light and fear, imagine the sound. A cough. It's not a simple cough to clear a throat. It's a deep, wet, racking sound that tears through the fragile silence of the night, a sound of utter violence coming from within. It's the sound of a body at war with itself. A young man who only a moon ago was a swift hunter lies on a pile of furs. His skin, once taut over strong muscle, is slick with a feverish sweat. His breath a shallow, stuttering rasp. His family huddles nearby, their faces illuminated in brief, worried flashes by the firelight, their expressions etched with a familiar, primal fear. This scene has played out before. They have seen this shadow fall over others. They don't know what we know. They have no name for the invisible invader consuming his lungs, no concept of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, no understanding of contagion. To them, this is not a biological process. It is a curse, a shard of ice blown into his chest by a malevolent wind spirit, a punishment from an ancestor angered by a forgotten trespass. The world is a place of unseen forces, and sickness is their most personal and terrifying expression. The shaman has been here. He wore a mask of carved wood and the pelt of a wolf, his face hidden to better see into the spirit world. He danced until sweat dripped from his brow. He chanted in a language of the gods. He shook a rattle made of dried gourds and raven feathers. It sounded like the hissing of a serpent. He offered poultices of river mud and chewed herbs, their bitter taste a hopeful magic. But the shadow in the man's chest has only grown darker, the cough more desperate. The spirit, it seems, are not listening. This is where our story begins, not in a gleaming laboratory or a sterile operating theater, but here, in the flickering darkness of our own prehistory, with a family helpless before an enemy they cannot comprehend. This is the story of humanity's longest and most intimate war. It is not a war fought with spears and arrows against beasts of the wild, but a silent, relentless siege fought with observation, with reason, with desperate gambles, and brilliant, world-altering flashes of insight. It's the story of our epic, stumbling, and heroic battle against the oldest adversary of all, disease. I'm Danny, and this is a new episode of English Plus Podcast, and today we're going to talk about the story of medicine, and we're going to start next with the first questions. Don't go anywhere. For tens of thousands of years, the scene in the cave repeated itself endlessly. A cycle of sickness, fear, and loss. We were at the mercy of an enemy we could not see, name, or understand. The first healers were not scientists. They were magicians, priests, and storytellers. They saw the world as a stage for cosmic drama, and illness was the role of the victim, a body possessed. The cure, therefore, lay not in the physical realm, but in the spiritual. In appeasing the divine, in exorcising the demonic, in reenacting the myths of creation to restore cosmic order to a single suffering body. And yet, amidst the incense and the incantations, something else was happening, almost by accident. It was a quieter, more patient kind of magic. Observation. A woman gathering plants notices that the leaves of a certain willow tree, when chewed, seem to ease the throbbing pain of a swollen joint. She doesn't know about salicylic acid, but she knows relief. A man learns that cleaning a deep gash with wine, rather than river water, makes it less likely to fill with foul-smelling pus. He has no concept of antisepsis, but he sees the result. This was not science as we know it, it was trial and error on a massive scale. A vast and brutal clinical trial played out over countless generations. Knowledge was a flickering candle passed from mother to daughter, from master to apprentice, often extinguished by a single death, but sometimes, just sometimes, burning a little brighter. The first great library of this accumulated knowledge arose from the fertile black mud of the Nile. The ancient Egyptians, whose civilization was built around a profound and elaborate preparation for death, paradoxically developed a sophisticated interest in preserving life. Their medical texts, like the famous Ebers Papyrus from around 1550 BCE, were a fascinating blend of the mystical and the methodical. Alongside prayer to Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plague, were detailed instructions for surgical procedures, recipes for over 700 medicinal compounds, from acacia and honey to crocodile dung, and the first known clinical descriptions of conditions like depression, dementia, and even tetanus. They could set bones with splints, drain abscesses with bronze scalpels, and had a rudimentary understanding of the heart and vessels, believing the pulse was the heart speaking through the body. Their belief that the heart, not the brain, was the seat of intelligence led them to carefully preserve it during mummification and unceremoniously discarding the brain. They were cataloging the battlefield with meticulous care, even if they didn't understand the nature of the war. But the first true revolution in thought, the moment the entire premise of the war changed, came from the sun-drenched shores of the Aegean Sea. It was here that a physician named Hippocrates, living on the island of Kos around 400 BCE, made a proposition so radical it was world-changing. He looked at the sick and suffering, at the epileptic seizing on the ground, a condition then called the sacred disease, and declared their afflictions were not the work of angry gods, but the result of understandable natural causes. This was a seismic shift. It was the moment humanity decided to stop pleading with shadows and start investigating the light. It was the birth of rational medicine. Hippocrates and his followers proposed that the body was governed by 4 essential fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each was linked to an element: air, water, fire, earth, and a season: spring, winter, summer, autumn. A healthy person had these humors in perfect balance. Illness was simply a state of imbalance, an internal disharmony. Too much phlegm, associated with winter and water, caused the cold. Too much black bile, associated with autumn and earth, caused melancholy. The logic was elegant, comprehensive, and as we now know, completely wrong. Yet its wrongness is less important than its premise. For the first time, health and disease were framed as an internal mechanical problem that could be understood and, therefore, potentially solved through human intervention. The goal of the Hippocratic physician was not to perform miracles, but to help the body restore its own balance, to aid nature's healing power through diet, rest, and gentle interventions. They were the first to systematically record patient histories, to note the progression of symptoms, to understand that a disease has a natural course. And in their most enduring legacy, they swore an oath to act in the best interests of their patients, to maintain confidentiality, and above all, to do no harm. They gave medicine its conscience. The Romans, practical engineers and ambitious empire builders, inherited this Greek framework and applied it with ruthless efficiency. The physician Galen of Pergamon, who served the gladiators and emperors of the 2nd century CE, became the undisputed and absolute authority on medicine for the next 1500 years. He was a brilliant anatomist for his time, patching up mauled gladiators in the arena's infirmary, an unparalleled laboratory for studying trauma. Since human dissection was forbidden by Roman law, He dissected countless Barbary apes, pigs, and goats, making brilliant inferences about the human body. He correctly identified that arteries carry blood, not air, as was previously believed, and understood the function of nerves originating from the brain and spinal cord by severing them in live animals to see which muscles were paralyzed. But Galen's brilliance was also a trap. He was a dogmatist. He fitted all his meticulous observations into the Hippocratic theory of humors, creating a system so complete, so intellectually satisfying and authoritative that to question it was to question reality itself. He became the final word, not the first step. And as the Roman Empire crumbled and its aqueducts ran dry, its libraries burned, and its public order dissolved into chaos, that final word was all that was left. The flickering candle of medical knowledge was about to be plunged into a long, cold twilight. And now we'll move to the next chapter, The Keepers of the Flame. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. The fall of Rome was a republic health catastrophe on a continental scale. As cities decayed and trade routes collapsed, the sanitation systems, medical schools, and accumulated knowledge of the classical world vanished. Life expectancy plummeted. The intricate theories of Galen were simplified, misunderstood, and replaced by a resurgence of superstition and folk magic. The enemy, disease, was on the offensive, sweeping through populations that had lost their defenses. This vulnerability was laid bare in the mid-14th century when a terrifying new plague swept out of the East. The Black Death was an invisible, indiscriminate killer. It emptied villages, shattered economies, and shook the foundations of faith. It is estimated to have killed up to half the population of Europe, a biological holocaust that left a deep psychological scar on the continent. The physicians of the day, clad in their haunting bird-like masks stuffed with aromatic herbs to ward off the miasma, or bad air they believed caused the plague, were utterly helpless. They tried bleeding, lancing the buboes, and offering prayers. Nothing worked. The theory of humors had no answer for Yersinia pestis. But while Europe languished, the candle was not extinguished. It had been carried east, to the flourishing cosmopolitan cities of the Islamic Golden Age. In Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, scholars, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian alike, avidly translated the Greek texts of Hippocrates and Galen into Arabic, not just preserving them, but interrogating, refining, and building upon them. Great hospitals or bimarstans were established, which were not just places for the sick to die, but true centers of healing, teaching, and research with separate wards for different diseases, pharmacies, and vast libraries. Figures like Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi in the 9th century were masters of clinical observation. He managed a great hospital in Baghdad and wrote the first clear accounts distinguishing smallpox from measles, noting that survivors of one did not get the other, a hint of the concept of acquired immunity. He championed reason over dogma and famously wrote a treatise titled Doubts About Galen, a work of almost unthinkable heresy in a Europe that regarded Galen as infallible. A century later, the Persian polymath Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna in the West, wrote Al-Qanun fil Tibb, or the Canon of Medicine. This monumental 5-volume encyclopedia was a breathtaking synthesis of all known medical knowledge, from Greco-Roman sources to Indian and Persian traditions, all organized with systematic brilliance. It cataloged diseases, described surgical procedures, and listed 760 different drugs. It was so logical, so comprehensive, that when it was eventually translated into Latin, it replaced Galen's work and became the standard medical textbook in European universities for the next 600 years. The Islamic world had not just kept the flame alive, they had fed it, organized it, and built a great lighthouse of knowledge that would eventually guide Europe out of the darkness. The first light of dawn in Europe came with the Renaissance, a cultural explosion fueled by rediscovered texts and a new human-centered worldview. It was a time of renewed curiosity. a belief that humanity could and should look at the world for itself. And one man took that idea more literally and more bravely than anyone else. His name was Andreas Vesalius. A young Flemish physician in the 16th century, Vesalius was a professor at the prestigious University of Padua, a place where the old ways were still king. He was supposed to sit on a high throne and read from the works of Galen, while a lowly barber surgeon, considered a manual laborer, performed the actual dissection on the corpse below. But Vesalius was a man of the new age, filled with a burning need to see for himself. Frustrated by the constant discrepancies between the ancient text and the body on the table, he pushed the surgeon aside, grabbed the scalpel, and looked with his own eyes. What he found was shocking. A cascade of errors that had been passed down for centuries. Galen, who had only dissected apes and pigs, had described a human liver with 5 lobes, like an ape's, a jaw made of 2 bones, like a pig's, and a breastbone in 7 segments, like a monkey's. Vesalius saw the truth: a 2-lobed liver, a single-bone jaw, a 3-part sternum. But most critically, he saw that the septum of the heart was a solid wall of muscle with no invisible pores for blood to pass through from one side to the other, as Galen had insisted for his theory of blood circulation to work. In 1543, Vesalius published his masterpiece, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. It was not just a book, it was a revolution, filled with exquisite, detailed anatomical illustrations based on direct observation. It was the first accurate map of the human body. Vesalius tore down 1,500 years of dogma with the simple, powerful act of looking. He was vilified by the establishment, his former teachers calling him an impious madman. He was accused of heresy and grave robbing, but he had changed the game. The body was no longer a theoretical landscape based on ancient texts. It was a real place, a continent to be explored. Yet, even with a perfect map, the enemy remained invisible. Doctors could now name every muscle and bone in a patient dying of a raging fever, but they were no closer to knowing why he was dying. They had mapped the battlefield with breathtaking precision, but the invader was still a ghost. And that brings me to the next chapter, the unveiling. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. The ghost was about to get a face. The discovery came not from a celebrated university professor, but from a Dutch draper named Antony van Leeuwenhoek. In the late 17th century, in the city of Delft, he had a peculiar hobby: grinding tiny lenses of extraordinary quality. He wasn't a scientist, but he was possessed by an insatiable curiosity. He created single-lens microscopes of such power and clarity that they were centuries ahead of their time, revealing a world no one knew existed. One day, he put a drop of pond water under his lens and peered in. He was stunned, mesmerized. The water was teeming with life, a bustling, invisible metropolis of what he called animalcules. He described them in letters to the Royal Society of London with childlike wonder. Wretched beasties, swimming and tumbling with incredibly great speed. He found them everywhere, in rainwater, in infusions of pepper, in the plaque scraped from his own teeth. He had opened a door to a new reality, a microscopic universe parallel to our own. For nearly 200 years, this discovery remained a fascinating curiosity. Scientists knew this microscopic world existed, but no one made the connection. The idea that these tiny creatures could be the cause of humanity's most devastating diseases was too outlandish, too far-fetched. The dominant theory remained the miasma theory, that disease was spread by foul-smelling air, a poisonous vapor rising from swamps, sewage, and decaying matter. It seemed logical. Slums stank, and slums were rife with disease. The theory drove public health initiatives, some useful, like cleaning streets, and some not. But it pointed the finger of blame at the environment, not at a transmissible agent. The first major offensive in the war, The first time we deliberately and successfully struck back at a specific disease came not from understanding the enemy, but from another brilliant act of observation. In the lush countryside of late 18th century England, a doctor named Edward Jenner noticed something the local folk had been saying for generations. Milkmaids who contracted cowpox, a mild disease from cattle that caused a few sores on their hands, never seemed to get smallpox, the terrifying and often fatal scourge of the age that left its survivors scarred and blinded. The idea was a folk belief, but Jenner, a man of the Enlightenment, decided to test it scientifically. In 1796, in an act that would be ethically unthinkable today, he took pus from a fresh cowpox sore on the hand of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms and scratched it into the arm of an 8-year-old boy, James Phipps, the son of his gardener. The boy developed a slight fever and felt unwell for a day or two, but quickly recovered. The crucial, terrifying moment came a few weeks later. Jenner deliberately exposed the boy to smallpox. He waited. Nothing happened. The boy was completely immune. Jenner had performed the world's first vaccination. And this word comes from vacca, the Latin for cow. He didn't know why it worked. The concept of viruses was centuries away, but he knew that it worked. He had found a shield. But shields weren't enough. We needed to understand the attacker itself. And the story of that discovery is one of the most tragic and heroic in the history of science. In the 1840s, the Vienna General Hospital was one of the finest in Europe, but it had a dark and terrifying secret. The first maternity clinic, staffed by distinguished doctors and their medical students, had a horrifying rate of puerperal fever or childbed fever. In some months, up to a third of the women who gave birth there died in agony. The second clinic, right next door and staffed only by midwives, was vastly safer. Women begged on their knees to be admitted to the second clinic. A young Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis was haunted by this discrepancy. It was, he wrote, a murderous enigma. He investigated everything: birthing positions, climate, even the route the priest took to deliver last rites, thinking his presence was a terrifying psychological trigger. He found no answer. The mystery tormented him until one day, a colleague and friend cut his finger while performing an autopsy of a woman who had died of childbed fever. The colleague sickened and died, and Semmelweis saw that his body showed the same pathology as the dead mother's. The truth struck Semmelweis like a bolt of lightning, a moment of sickening clarity. The doctors and students were coming directly from the autopsy room, where they dissected the bodies of the dead, to the delivery room, where they examined expectant mothers. They were carrying cadaverous particles on their unwashed hands. The midwives, who performed no autopsies, were not. He instituted a new mandatory policy. All physicians must wash their hands in a chlorine solution before entering the maternity ward. The results were immediate and staggering. The death rate in his clinic plummeted by 90%, falling to the same low level as the midwife's clinic. Semmelweis had found the answer. He had proven that an invisible agent passed from person to person was the cause of the disease. He had saved countless lives. And for this, he was destroyed. The medical establishment was outraged. The idea that the gentlemanly hands of a doctor could be unclean and transmit death was a profound personal and professional insult. It flew in the face of the established miasma theory. They viewed him as a fanatic, a troublemaker. Semmelweis was ridiculed, his findings dismissed. He was driven from Vienna, his career in ruins. He grew increasingly erratic and angry, writing furious, desperate open letters to the leading obstetricians of Europe, calling them murderers. In 1868, broken and bitter, he was committed to an asylum. He died there 2 weeks later at the age of 47 from septicemia, blood poisoning from an infected wound on his hand. He died of the very kind of infection he had taught the world how to prevent. Ignaz Semmelweis was a martyr to the truth. He had the right answer, but he lacked the ultimate proof. He couldn't show them the cadaverous particles under a microscope. That final, irrefutable evidence would be provided by two titans who would at last turn on the lights. And that's coming in our next chapter, The Enemy Identified. Don't go anywhere, I'll be right back. In France, a chemist named Louis Pasteur was called upon to solve a series of practical problems for French industry. Why was wine and beer souring? Why were silkworms dying? Using his microscope, he found the answer was always the same: microbes. He demonstrated that these germs were not spontaneously generated from decay, as was widely believed, but were carried in the air and on surfaces, landing on and colonizing suitable environments. His famous swan neck flask experiment, in which a sterilized broth remained clear until the flask was tipped to allow airborne dust to enter, was the death blow to the theory of spontaneous generation. The implications were profound. If microbes could spoil wine and sicken silkworms, could they not also spoil a living body? He had found the enemy's infiltration route. Meanwhile, in Germany, a quiet, meticulous country doctor named Robert Koch was about to give the enemy a name and a face. Obsessed with anthrax, a disease that ravaged local livestock, he worked tirelessly in a makeshift lab in his home. Using a piece of wood, he would painstakingly isolate the rod-shaped bacterium from the blood of an infected sheep. He figured out how to grow it in a pure culture on a potato slice, a revolutionary technique. He photographed it, documented its life cycle, and then injected it into healthy mice, which then sickened and died of anthrax. From their blood, he isolated the same bacterium again. He had fulfilled a set of conditions, now known as Koch's postulates, that provided a rigorous, repeatable method for identifying the specific germ that caused a specific disease. It was the final, definitive proof. The germ theory of disease was born. The old, vague ideas of humors and miasmas were swept away forever. Semmelweis had been vindicated. The lights were on. The ghost was a microbe. And now the hunt was on. What followed was a golden age of bacteriology, a period of breathtakingly rapid discovery. Koch, Pasteur, and their students and rivals working in laboratories across Europe identified the culprits behind the greatest killers of humankind one by one: tuberculosis, cholera, diphtheria, tetanus, typhoid, plague. It was as if the most wanted criminals in history were finally having their mugshots taken. For the first time, we knew the names and faces of our assassins. But knowing the enemy was one thing, killing it was another. The British surgeon Joseph Lister, a Quaker who was deeply troubled by the horrific death rates in his surgical wards, read Pasteur's work. He reasoned that if invisible germs in the air caused putrefaction in wounds, then killing those germs should prevent post-operative infection. He began spraying his operating theater and soaking his instruments and dressings in carbolic acid, an antiseptic. The stench was awful, but the results were miraculous. Surgery, once a gruesome gamble where the infection was more deadly than the knife, was transformed into a truly life-saving procedure. The war had turned. We had a map, Vesalius, a shield, Jenner, and now a strategy. Kill the germs. Lister, Pasteur, Koch. But we were still missing the ultimate weapon. We were fighting the enemy at the gates, on the skin, in the operating room. We had no way to hunt it down once it had breached the walls and was multiplying inside the fortress of the body. And that brings me to the next chapter, the magic bullets. Don't go anywhere, I'll be right back. The discovery of that weapon, like so many great leaps, came not from a systematic search, but from a moment of pure serendipity. In September 1928, a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming returned to his cluttered laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London after a vacation. He was notoriously untidy. On his bench was a stack of Petri dishes he hadn't cleaned before leaving, each growing colonies of Staphylococcus bacteria. As he sorted through them, he noticed something odd on one dish. A stray mold spore, a speck of blue-green fluff, had landed and grown. But all around the mold, there was a clear bacteria-free zone. It was as if the mold had cast an invisible shield. Many would have simply discarded the contaminated plate. But Fleming was intrigued. "That's funny," he mused. He isolated the mold, identified it as a strain of penicillium, and found that the mold juice it produced was astonishingly effective at killing a wide range of deadly bacteria, yet seemed completely harmless to human cells. He called this substance penicillin. Fleming was a brilliant observer, but not the chemist needed to turn this promising juice into a stable, usable drug. For over a decade, penicillin remained a lab curiosity, a footnote in a scientific journal. It took the immense pressure of the Second World War to resurrect it. A team at Oxford University, led by the Australian pathologist Howard Florey and the German Jewish refugee biochemist Ernst Chain, took on the monumental task of purification. The challenges were immense. They grew the mold in every container they could find, from bedpans to bathtubs. The yield was heartbreakingly small. It took them gallons of mold filtrate to produce enough penicillin to cover a fingernail. Their first human trial was on a 43-year-old policeman called Albert Alexander, who was dying of septicemia from a simple scratch from a rose thorn. His body was covered in abscesses. They began injecting their precious purified penicillin. The effect was miraculous. Within days, his fever dropped, his appetite returned, he was healing. But their supply ran out. Desperately, they even tried to extract the drug from his urine to re-administer it. It wasn't enough. The infection roared back, and he died. It was a tragic failure, but it proved the drug worked. With massive funding from the US government, industrial-scale production began, and by D-Day in 1944, there was enough penicillin to treat all Allied casualties. Penicillin was the first true antibiotic. It was the magic bullet that scientists had dreamed of for decades, a weapon that could seek and destroy the enemy within the body without harming the host. The age of antibiotics had begun. For the first time, diseases that had been death sentences for all of humanity history, pneumonia, syphilis, gonorrhea, meningitis, scarlet fever, became curable with a simple course of injections. Life expectancy soared. It was, without exaggeration, one of the single greatest triumphs in human history. The 20th century became a cascade of such triumphs. We learned to synthesize vitamins, ending diseases like scurvy and rickets. The discovery of hormones and the purification of insulin by Banting and Best in the 1920s transformed type 1 diabetes from a rapid, fatal disease into a manageable condition. We developed powerful new vaccines, culminating in the heroic efforts of Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin, who, by the 1950s and 60s, had developed two different vaccines that conquered polio, the terrifying disease that had crippled hundreds of thousands of children and struck fear into the hearts of every parent. The development of X-rays and later CAT scans and MRIs allowed us to peer inside the living body without a knife, making diagnosis a science of sight, not just inference. And the discovery of DNA's double helix in 1953 by Watson and Crick, with crucial uncredited contributions from Rosalind Franklin, unlocked the very blueprint of life, opening the door to understanding and eventually manipulating our own genetic code. It seemed for a moment that we were on the verge of total victory. The Surgeon General of the United States in 1969 declared it was time to close the book on infectious diseases. We had driven the enemy into retreat on all fronts. We had become masters of our own biology. But we now know that this is a never-ending war. We stand today in a world utterly transformed by this story. The child with a bacterial infection receives an antibiotic and is well in a week. The surgeon performs open-heart surgery in a sterile field, a procedure that would have been unimaginable butchery just 150 years ago. The vaccine for smallpox was so successful that the disease was declared globally eradicated in 1980, which is the only human disease we have ever completely wiped from the face of the earth. These are the victories of Hippocrates, Vesalius, Semmelweis, Pasteur, and Fleming. We live longer, healthier lives in the world they built. But the war is not over. It will never be over. The enemy has not surrendered. It is a shapeshifter, a master of adaptation, a product of the same evolutionary forces that created us. The very antibiotics that were our magic bullets are losing their power as bacteria, through the relentless pressure of natural selection, evolve resistance at an alarming rate. We face the terrifying prospect of a post-antibiotic era where a simple cut or a routine surgery could once again be fatal. New enemies constantly emerge. In the 1980s, a mysterious and terrifying virus called HIV appeared, exploiting the very immune cells meant to protect us, turning our own defenses against us. A global scientific effort has thankfully turned it from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition for those with access to treatment. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic reminded us with brutal force that a novel virus in a world connected by air travel can bring our modern civilization to its knees in a matter of months. Yet it also showed us our strengths. The development of revolutionary mRNA vaccines in under a year was a scientific triumph built on decades of prior research, a testament to our own ability to adapt. And as we achieve partial victory over infectious diseases, we face a new set of challenges. The chronic, complex diseases of aging like cancer, Alzheimer's, and heart disease. These are not foreign invaders in the same way. They are civil wars, rebellions of our own cells, breakdowns in our own intricate biology. The battlefield has shifted once more from the external world to the internal landscape of our own genomes and metabolisms. The story of medicine, my friends, is not a story with an ending. It is a relay race, a passing of the torch of knowledge from one generation to the next. It is the story of the human mind refusing to accept the world as it is, insisting on asking why. It is a story of incredible courage and tragic folly, of brilliant insights born from serendipity to stubborn dogma that cost countless lives. It is the story of us, of our profound fragility and our astonishing resilience, of our capacity for wonder and our relentless primal drive to pull our loved ones back from the shadow. The fire in the cave has been replaced by the fluorescent light of the ICU, the shaman's rattle by the rhythmic, reassuring beep of the heart monitor. The fear is still there, a ghost in the machine, but now so is knowledge, and so is the hope. The battle continues. With that, my friends, we come to the end of our episode. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the story of medicine. And if you haven't listened to the other episodes from this series, you can go back in the podcast and listen to them. We have the story of physics, chemistry, biology, and more. And of course, I will have to tell you that these episodes are all premium. So if you would like to access these episodes, you can do that by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or on Patreon. I hope you learned something today you didn't know about before, but of course that's just the introduction. If you really want to learn the story of medicine, you will have to dig in deep, do your own search and learn about this fascinating history of medicine. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for your time. I will see you again next time. And remember, never stop learning with English Plus Podcast.